The drills started at 2 in the morning, not because anything had gone wrong, but because someone in Washington had decided that if the bombs ever fell, the people who needed to keep the country running would have less than 15 minutes to disappear underground. That decision shaped the next 40 years of American construction. Between the late 1940s and the early 1980s, the United States quietly built a network of hardened underground facilities across its own territory. Some housed presidents, some housed missiles, some housed nothing the public was ever told about. The official story is that these bunkers were built for continuity, to keep government functioning after a nuclear strike. That explanation is true, but it is also incomplete. There were 17 major classified underground complexes, possibly more, and the reasons each one was built tell a different story about what American planners actually believed would happen and what they feared most. Start with the fear itself. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon, years ahead of American estimates. The CIA had predicted the Soviets would need until at least 1953. They were wrong by 4 years. That miscalculation changed everything. President Harry Truman, sitting in the Oval Office that September, received the intelligence briefing in silence. The window for American nuclear monopoly had closed. Now both sides had the weapon, and neither side had anywhere to hide. Within months, a classified program called Project Greek Island was already underway. And that was only the beginning. The geography of the American underground network followed a simple logic. Facilities needed to be close enough to Washington to be useful, but far enough outside the blast radius to survive. That radius, for a weapon of the size available in the early 1950s, was roughly 50 kilometers. That calculation pointed planners toward the Appalachian Mountains, hard granite, stable geology, hundreds of meters of solid rock overhead. The mountains of Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania became the backbone of what would eventually be called the Federal Relocation Arc, a crescent of underground bunkers intended to preserve enough of the American government to negotiate or retaliate or simply keep the lights on. The most famous of these facilities sits beneath the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. It operated for 30 years under a cover story so ordinary it almost sounds like a joke. Congress needed a backup meeting place. A luxury hotel with a newly renovated wing seemed like a reasonable explanation for a large construction project. Workers dug into the hillside, concrete walls went up, blast doors were installed. 18 stories of government emergency space hidden beneath a 5-star resort. The facility contained separate chambers for the House of Representatives and the Senate, an auditorium, a broadcast center, a medical clinic with a crematorium, because the planners had done the math on casualties and wanted no ambiguity about what would be done with bodies. The Greenbrier bunker was never used in an actual emergency. It was decommissioned in 1992 after a reporter named Ted Gupp published its existence in the Washington Post. The government chose disclosure over argument. The facility became a tourist attraction, but the Greenbrier was the polished version, the public-facing end of a much darker system. 50 kilometers away, beneath a Virginia hillside called Mount Weather, a different kind of facility was being built, not for Congress, for whoever survived. Mount Weather, formerly known as the Special Facility, was designed to house the president, the cabinet, and the leadership of every major federal agency. It had its own water supply, its own power generation, streets, cafeterias, a radio station capable of broadcasting to whatever remained of the civilian population. Full streets. Inside a mountain, construction began in the early 1950s and continued for nearly a decade. The excavated space reached hundreds of thousands of square feet. Workers used the same controlled blasting techniques being developed simultaneously for interstate highway tunnels. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956, signed by Eisenhower, was itself partly justified on civil defense grounds. The math was relentless. 45 minutes from Soviet launch to American impact, 15 minutes of warning at best. The president and senior officials would need to board helicopters within minutes of an alert, fly to a secure location, and be underground before the warheads arrived. Everything in the system was built around that 15-minute window, which is why, somewhere around 1958, the planners ran into a problem they had not fully anticipated. 15 minutes was not enough to evacuate elected government. Not reliably, not consistently. A president could leave, key cabinet members could follow, but 235 members of the House, 96 senators, 9 Supreme Court justices, the constitutional structure of American government, could not board helicopters in time from their homes, their offices, their committee hearings. The Greenbrier had been built for Congress. But getting Congress there in a real crisis was a fantasy. This is where the logic of the underground cities shifted. If elected government could not be reliably evacuated, then unelected continuity had to be built instead. In the 1960s, a classified program began assigning senior civil servants to what were called emergency relocation groups. Each group was pre-assigned to a specific underground facility. They trained in secret, they knew their destination, they practiced departure drills, not senators, not cabinet members, career administrators, the people who ran the IRS, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Communications Commission, the machinery of the state that kept running, regardless of who sat in the elected offices. The underground cities were being built not just for survival, but for a specific kind of survival. One where democratic legitimacy might not outlast the bombs, but administrative function would. That realization has never fully entered the public understanding of the Cold War. There were facilities beyond the Virginia mountains. Raven Rock, cut into South Mountain in Pennsylvania, was known informally as the Underground Pentagon. It housed the military command structures that would survive a decapitation strike, the communication systems, the war planning offices, the nuclear authorization protocols. NORAD, built inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, was the Air Defense Nerve Center. It cost around $142 million in 1960s money, sat on an internal suspension system of more than 1,000 steel springs to absorb blast shock, and was designed to remain operational after a near miss from a nuclear warhead. Near miss. The engineers had calculated the acceptable distance. There were smaller facilities too, regional federal continuity centers, scattered across the country, underground relay stations for the emergency broadcast system, hardened communications nodes disguised as ordinary telephone exchanges. The network was vast. Most of it was maintained by contractors who were told only what they needed to know. By the 1970s, the program had grown so large that different parts of it were no longer aware of each other. The Pentagon's underground command did not always coordinate with the civilian emergency relocation program. The Federal Reserve's continuity planners operated separately from those of the Treasury. Each agency had its own facility, its own drills, its own protocols, 17 major complexes by the most conservative count, dozens of secondary sites, hundreds of millions of dollars in annual maintenance, buried in classified budget lines. The question the program never answered cleanly was this: what exactly would be preserved? A government that survived underground while its cities burned would emerge into a country of ruins and grief. Its authority would rest not on democratic mandate, no one could vote in the aftermath, but on whatever organizational capacity had been physically protected. Continuity of function, not continuity of consent. That tension was acknowledged, quietly, in some of the planning documents that have since been declassified. One report from the early 1970s noted that the legal basis for post-attack governance had never been fully resolved. The Constitution did not contain provisions for government in hiding. It still does not. The Cold War ended without the bombs falling. The Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991. Within 2 years, several of the major facilities had been quietly downgraded or decommissioned. The Greenbrier was exposed and converted. Mount Weather remains operational under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but its mission has shifted toward natural disaster response rather than nuclear survival. Raven Rock still operates. Cheyenne Mountain was placed on warm standby and then reactivated after September 11, 2001, when American planners remembered why it had been built. Some facilities have never been publicly identified. What the underground cities left behind is not just concrete and blast doors. It is a set of institutional habits, the practice of imagining the state surviving the death of the society it governs. That idea did not disappear when the Cold War ended. It was absorbed into continuity of government planning that continues today in programs that remain classified. The drills still happen. The destinations still exist. The 15-minute window has been recalculated for new threats. The underground cities were never really about nuclear war. They were about the oldest fear in any government, that the machine might stop, that the people running it might be gone, that no one would be left to answer the phone when the world needed someone to answer it. Whether that fear justifies what was built and what was never told to the public is a question the documents cannot settle. The story of these facilities is still incomplete. Some of what was built is still unknown, and some of what is known has still not been made public. The mountains keep their own account.